the street no one remembers. Every city has streets that people pass through every day without thinking about them. Roads become familiar simply because they are always there, part of the quiet background of daily life. But sometimes when you look closely at the past, you find something strange hidden inside old records. Something that doesn't quite fit with the version of the city people remember today. This particular mystery begins with a small street that appears in nearly every historical map of the city. Urban planning documents from the 1950s show it clearly, labeled just like any other residential road. Old survey maps from the 1970s mention it again, marking rows of houses and narrow connecting paths between nearby neighborhoods. Even early digital satellite archives from the late 1990s still display the same street, quietly sitting between two larger roads. Nothing about it seemed unusual. It wasn't a major landmark. It wasn't famous or historically significant. It was simply another small residential street, the kind most people would never think twice about. And yet today, something about it makes no sense. Because if you ask anyone about the street now, no one seems to recognize it. Local residents who have lived in the area for decades will tell you they have never heard of it. Shop owners nearby insist that the space has always been occupied by the same buildings. Even older members of the community, people who claim to remember the neighborhood as it looked 40 or 50 years ago, shake their heads when the street's name is mentioned. According to them, it has never existed. At first, this might sound like a simple misunderstanding. Cities change over time. Streets are renamed, rebuilt, or removed entirely as new developments replace older neighborhoods. Records become messy, and sometimes a street disappears simply because it was merged into another road or demolished to make room for something new. But this situation is different, because the historical maps do not show a street that was removed. They show a street that should still be there. The surrounding buildings on the map still exist today. The nearby intersections match perfectly with modern satellite images. The layout of the neighborhood remains almost identical to how it appeared decades ago. Everything is the same, except for that one street. Sometime in the early 2000s, the name quietly vanished from official city records. Updated maps stopped labeling it. Digital mapping systems removed the street entirely, as if someone had simply erased it from the database. No announcement, no redevelopment notice, no record explaining what happened. The street simply disappeared from the system. And over time, something even stranger happened. People stopped remembering it. Ask around the neighborhood today, and most residents will confidently tell you that the street was never part of the city at all. To them, the old maps are wrong, relics from a time when cartographers sometimes made mistakes. But when you place the old maps beside the modern ones, the evidence becomes difficult to ignore. The street appears again and again across decades of documentation, carefully drawn, consistently labeled, recorded by multiple sources that had no connection to each other, which raises an unsettling possibility. What if the maps were never wrong? What if the street was always there and something else is the thing that changed? The maps that shouldn't exist. The first person to notice the problem wasn't a historian, an investigator, or a journalist looking for a story. It was just someone scrolling through old digital archives late at night. He had been browsing historical city maps, the kind that libraries and government offices slowly digitized over the past 2 decades. Thousands of documents had been scanned, cataloged, and uploaded to online databases where anyone could explore how the city once looked. At first, the process was simple, curiosity. People often enjoy comparing old maps to modern satellite images, watching how neighborhoods slowly change over time. Buildings disappear, roads expand, entire districts transform into something unrecognizable. But occasionally, a small detail stands out. In this case, it was a street name that appeared again and again. At first, it seemed completely ordinary. The street showed up on a city planning map dated 1954. It appeared again in a municipal survey from 1972. Another copy surfaced in a zoning document from the early 1980s. Every version showed the same narrow road positioned between 2 larger streets in a quiet residential district. Nothing about the street looked unusual. It had houses drawn along both sides of the road. The map legends indicated residential zoning. In one record from the 1990s, the street even had a designated postal code. It was clearly part of the city's infrastructure. The records were consistent. The cartography was precise. Multiple independent sources had documented the same place across nearly 50 years. If anything, the street looked more legitimate than many others in the archives. But something strange happened when he tried to find it on modern maps. At first, he assumed the name had simply been changed. Cities rename streets all the time for political, cultural, or administrative reasons. Sometimes a small road is merged into a larger one, absorbing its identity and disappearing from future maps. But when he searched the city database for historical name changes, the street wasn't listed. There was no record of it ever being renamed. So he checked another possibility. Perhaps the street had been demolished. Urban redevelopment projects often erase entire neighborhoods, replacing them with apartment complexes, shopping centers, or highways. If that had happened, there should have been building permits or demolition records somewhere in the system. But again, nothing appeared. No redevelopment permit, no demolition approval, no infrastructure change. It was as if the street had simply vanished without leaving any trace behind. Curiosity turned into something closer to confusion. So he began digging deeper into the digital archives. More maps appeared. An engineering survey from 1968, a postal service routing document from 1979, a city utilities diagram from the early 1990s showing underground water and electrical lines running directly beneath the street. All of them clearly displayed the same road. The evidence kept repeating itself. Different departments, different decades, different map makers, all documenting the same location. And yet when he opened the most recent version of the city's official digital map, the street wasn't there. Not renamed, not merged, not marked as closed. It simply didn't exist. At first, he wondered if the problem might be a technical error. Large digital databases occasionally lose information when systems are updated. A corrupted file or a missing layer could cause certain map elements to disappear temporarily. But when he compared several modern mapping platforms, the result was identical. Every new map showed the same empty space where the street should have been. Two larger roads still ran parallel on each side. The surrounding buildings still appeared. The entire neighborhood was intact. Everything matched the historical records perfectly. Everything except the street itself. That was the moment when the situation stopped looking like a normal archival mistake. Because if a single map had been wrong, it would be easy to explain. If one database had been corrupted, that would also make sense. But when dozens of historical records all agree on the existence of something that modern systems refuse to acknowledge, the question becomes much harder to answer. At some point in the early 2000s, something had changed. Not just the maps, but the records themselves. As if someone had quietly decided that the street should no longer be part of the city's history and then removed it from the future. The street that was still there. Once the pattern became impossible to ignore, the next step felt obvious. If the street had existed in the past, and if no record showed it being demolished or renamed, then there was only one way to settle the question. Someone had to go there and see what was actually at the location. Finding the place wasn't difficult. The old maps were detailed enough to identify the exact position. The missing street had been located between two larger roads that still existed today. Both of those roads appeared clearly on modern maps, and the surrounding neighborhood had barely changed over the decades. Apartment buildings stood where they always had. Small shops still lined the corners. The intersections matched almost perfectly with the layout shown in the historical documents. According to the maps, the street should have been only a few minutes away from a busy main road, the kind of place where people passed by every day without paying much attention to the smaller side streets nearby, which made the mystery even stranger. If a road had once existed there, someone should remember it, but no one did. On a quiet afternoon, he decided to walk to the location. At first, nothing looked unusual. The neighborhood felt ordinary in the way most residential districts do. Cars moved slowly through narrow streets. A few people walked along the sidewalks carrying groceries. Somewhere in the distance, a television could be heard through an open window. It was the kind of environment where everything blended into routine. Nothing stood out. But when he reached the point where the missing street should have been, he slowed down because something was there. Not an empty lot, not a construction site, not a parking area or a collapsed building. There was a street. A narrow road opening quietly between two older buildings, almost hidden from the main intersection unless you were specifically looking for it. For a moment he wondered if he had made a mistake. Maybe this was a different road with a different name. But when he checked the alignment with the old maps, the position matched perfectly. The same angle, the same distance between the surrounding structures. Everything lined up exactly with the historical documents. The street hadn't been destroyed. It hadn't been replaced. It was still there. From the entrance, it looked completely ordinary. The road itself was narrow, barely wide enough for a single car to pass through comfortably. Small houses stood on both sides, their walls worn slightly by time but clearly maintained. Balconies extended over the sidewalk. Laundry hung from metal railings. Potted plants lined doorways and windowsills. Someone had placed a bicycle against a wooden fence near the corner. Life was happening here. Children's voices echoed somewhere farther down the street. A dog barked briefly from behind a gate. The faint smell of cooking drifted through the air from an open kitchen window. Nothing about the place suggested abandonment or secrecy. If anything, it looked like one of the most normal streets in the entire neighborhood. People were clearly living here, which immediately created a problem because according to the official city records, none of these buildings should exist. There should have been no addresses, no property registrations, no residents. But standing there at the entrance of the street, it was impossible to deny the evidence in front of him. Lights were on inside several homes. Curtains moved gently in the breeze. Someone inside one of the houses laughed, the sound briefly carrying into the quiet afternoon air. This wasn't an abandoned location. It was an active community. The deeper he walked into the street, the more details appeared. A small mailbox cluster attached to a wall. Scratches on the pavement from years of bicycles and motorbikes passing through. A faded sign above one doorway that might once have displayed the house number, though the paint had worn away too much to read clearly. Everything about the environment suggested history, not just a few years, but decades of ordinary life. Families had lived here, children had grown up here, people had probably spent their entire lives on this street, and yet the city had no record of any of it. Halfway down the road, he began to notice something else. People were watching him, not in an aggressive way, not with suspicion, but with a quiet awareness. A woman watering plants paused for a moment as he walked past. An elderly man sitting near a doorway followed him with his eyes. Two children playing with a ball stopped their game briefly to look in his direction before continuing again. None of them seemed surprised to see a stranger, but none of them looked confused either. Instead, there was a strange feeling that the residents already knew something about him, as if his presence on the street wasn't unexpected, as if they had been waiting for him to arrive. And that was the moment when the situation began to feel far less like a simple cartography mystery. Because finding a forgotten street was one thing, but finding a street that still existed, with people living inside it, while the entire city insisted it had never been there at all, was something else entirely. The people who didn't exist. Later that night, long after he had left the street, the feeling that something wasn't right refused to disappear. The place had looked too normal. That was the part that bothered him the most. If the street had been abandoned, the mystery would have been easier to explain. Empty buildings sometimes slip through bureaucratic systems. Forgotten areas occasionally fall into strange gaps between city departments. But that wasn't what he had seen. People were living there. Children were playing in the street. Lights were on inside the houses. Someone had been cooking dinner. That meant the place should exist in dozens of different records. Modern cities document everything: property ownership, resident registrations, utility usage, postal deliveries. Even the most insignificant building leaves a digital trail somewhere inside the administrative system. So when he arrived home that evening, he opened his laptop and started searching. The first database he checked was the city's official property registry. Every legal building inside the city limits was supposed to appear there, along with the name of the owner and the date of construction approval. He searched the surrounding streets first. The buildings on both sides of the missing road appeared instantly. Addresses, ownership documents, permit histories, everything was exactly where it should be. Then he searched for the houses on the street he had just visited. Nothing appeared. He tried searching by address format. Still nothing. The system simply returned an empty result. At first, he assumed the problem might be a spelling error or an outdated naming convention, so he switched to a different database, the Municipal Resident Registration System. If people were living on that street, their name should appear somewhere in the population records. Cities track residents carefully for tax purposes, voting registration, and census data. Even temporary tenants usually appear in these systems eventually. But when he entered the street name into the database, the search field rejected it. The system responded with a short automated message: address not found. He tried searching the houses individually using approximate coordinates from the map. Again, the system found nothing. According to the city's population registry, no one had ever lived there. That result didn't make sense. So he opened another archive, the utilities database: electricity accounts, water connections, gas service registrations. Modern buildings cannot function without at least one of those systems connected. Even illegal structures usually appear somewhere in infrastructure records because they still need power and water. But the utilities map showed a strange blank space where the street should have been. Pipes and electrical lines ran through the surrounding neighborhood. Service connections branched off into nearby houses. But beneath the street itself, there was nothing. No cables, no water pipes, no gas infrastructure. According to the official infrastructure layout, the area simply did not exist. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. That was impossible. He had walked down the street himself. He had seen lights glowing behind windows. He had smelled food cooking inside the houses. Someone had been watering plants. Children had been playing in the road. Those things required electricity. They required water. They required people. Yet every digital system insisted that none of those things were real. The deeper he searched, the stranger the situation became. He opened archived satellite imagery from different years. The street appeared in older versions, faintly visible between buildings. But sometime in the early 2000s, the images became slightly different. The surrounding structures remained exactly the same, but the street itself seemed blurred, not erased, just subtly altered, as if the mapping software had decided that the space between the buildings wasn't important enough to display clearly. Newer mapping systems showed the same area as a narrow gap between structures, but no road was labeled there. No address markers appeared. No street name existed. To the digital world, the location had been reduced to empty space, and yet the people he had seen were very real. That realization left him with a strange question. If the city had no record of the buildings, and the infrastructure maps showed no utilities, then how were the residents living there at all? For a moment, he wondered if the street might be some kind of hidden community, an informal neighborhood that had somehow avoided official documentation. But even the most isolated communities leave traces: school registrations, healthcare records, mobile phone signals, postal deliveries. People cannot exist inside a modern city without interacting with the systems that surround them. But every system he checked told the same story. The street didn't exist, and neither did the people living on it. Eventually, he closed the laptop. The room was quiet. Outside his window, the normal city continued moving as it always had. Cars passed along the street. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed briefly through the night. Everything felt ordinary again, except for one detail. Earlier that afternoon, while walking through the strange street that wasn't supposed to exist, he had noticed something unusual about the residents. None of them had looked surprised to see him. They hadn't treated him like a stranger who had wandered into an unfamiliar neighborhood. Instead, they had watched him with a quiet recognition, as if they already knew exactly who he was and why he had come back. The man who recognized him. The next day he returned to the street. He told himself that he only wanted to confirm what he had already seen. Maybe there was some explanation he had missed the first time. Maybe the databases were outdated. Maybe the houses had been registered under a different district code or an older administrative system. Cities are complicated. Records sometimes overlap in strange ways. There had to be a reasonable answer somewhere. But as he walked back toward the entrance of the narrow road, the same quiet feeling from the previous afternoon returned. The street looked exactly the same. The same bicycles leaned against the same fences. The same laundry hung from the same balconies, moving slightly in the breeze. The same quiet sounds of everyday life drifted from behind open windows. Nothing about the place had changed. If anything, the street felt even more ordinary in the daylight. For a moment, he wondered if the mystery had only existed inside the databases, a bureaucratic problem that had nothing to do with the people living here. But then he noticed something. Several residents were looking at him again, not in the casual way people glance at strangers passing through a neighborhood. This felt different. Their eyes followed him as he walked further down the street. A woman watering plants paused for a few seconds longer than necessary before continuing. Two children playing near the middle of the road briefly stopped their game. An elderly man sitting on a low wooden chair outside one of the houses slowly lifted his head as the visitor approached. There was no hostility in their expressions, but there was something else: recognition. It was subtle, almost impossible to explain. The residents didn't seem curious about the stranger walking through their street. Instead, they watched him with the quiet awareness of people observing something they had already expected to happen, as if his presence there was not unusual, as if they had been waiting for him to arrive. He continued walking, trying not to make the situation feel awkward. But the deeper he moved into the street, the stronger that strange feeling became. These people didn't look surprised. They looked familiar, not that he recognized their faces. But the way they looked at him suggested something deeper, as if he was the unfamiliar one who had forgotten something important. Halfway down the road, someone finally spoke. "Excuse me." The voice came from the elderly man sitting outside one of the houses. He was thin, with gray hair and deeply lined features that suggested decades of quiet routine. His chair rested beside a small wooden door that opened directly onto the street. For a moment, the visitor stopped. The man studied him carefully, the way someone might observe an old photograph that had suddenly come to life. Then he asked a simple question: "Why are you here?" The visitor hesitated. It wasn't an aggressive question, but it felt strangely personal. Still, he answered honestly. He explained that he had been researching old city maps, that he had discovered a street that no longer appeared in official records, that he had come to see whether the place still existed in reality. The man listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change. The visitor continued explaining the strange results from the city databases, the missing property records, the absence of resident registrations, the lack of infrastructure data. According to every official system, this street should not exist. Yet here it was, full of houses, full of people. When the explanation ended, the old man remained silent for a few seconds. Then he slowly shook his head, not in disagreement, but in recognition. The kind of small, patient movement someone makes when hearing something they already understand. For a moment, the visitor wondered if the man was about to laugh, as if the entire situation had some obvious explanation he had overlooked. But instead, the old man spoke again. "You shouldn't be here." The sentence was calm, almost gentle. The visitor blinked, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" he asked. The old man looked directly into his eyes. There was no confusion in his expression, no doubt, only certainty. "You shouldn't be here," the man repeated quietly. Then he added something that made the entire street feel suddenly unfamiliar. "You left this place years ago." The visitor stared at him, certain he had misunderstood. "That's not possible," he said. I've never been here before. But the old man didn't argue. He didn't look surprised by the denial. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair and studied the visitor the way someone might observe a person who had forgotten something obvious. Around them, the quiet life of the street continued. A door opened somewhere behind them. The children resumed their game further down the road. A breeze moved through the hanging laundry above the houses. Everything felt normal, except for the strange certainty in the old man's voice. Finally, the resident spoke one more time. "Everyone leaves eventually," he said. His tone wasn't sad, it was simply a statement of fact. Then he looked toward the far end of the narrow street before finishing the thought. "But no one ever comes back." "You left this place years ago." For a few seconds after the old man spoke, neither of them said anything. The words hung in the air, quiet but heavy. "You left this place years ago." It was such a simple sentence, but the certainty in the man's voice made it impossible to dismiss as a misunderstanding. The visitor forced a small, confused smile. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else," he said. "I've never been here before." The old man didn't respond immediately. He simply continued watching him, the way someone might observe a friend who had just said something strange. There was no argument in his expression, no urgency, just a calm patience that made the situation even more uncomfortable. Around them, the street continued its quiet routine. Somewhere behind one of the houses, a door closed softly. A bicycle rolled past at the far end of the road. The same children who had been playing earlier were now laughing again, their voices echoing lightly between the narrow buildings. Everything felt ordinary, except for the conversation happening in the middle of it. "You really don't remember," the old man finally said. It wasn't a question. The visitor shook his head. "I've never seen this street before in my life." The resident leaned forward slightly in his chair, resting his hands on his knees. For a moment, he looked down at the pavement as if thinking about something far away. Then he spoke again. "You lived 3 houses down," he said quietly, gesturing toward the middle of the street. "There used to be a small blue door. You painted it yourself." The visitor turned his head instinctively in the direction the man had pointed. Halfway down the road, one of the houses did indeed have a faded blue door. The paint looked old, worn by years of sunlight and rain. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, the brief, uncomfortable feeling of recognition that appears when something almost seems familiar but refuses to become a memory. But he quickly pushed the thought away. "That can't be right," he said. "I grew up on the other side of the city." The old man nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. "Most people say that," he replied. The visitor frowned. "What does that mean?" For the first time, the old man looked slightly amused, not mocking, but patient, like someone who had heard the same conversation many times before. "People forget," he said. "They leave this street, and after a while, the rest of the city becomes the only place they remember." The visitor felt a chill move through him. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "If people lived here, there would be records, property documents, addresses, utility bills, something." The old man raised an eyebrow slightly. "Records?" he repeated. Then he gestured slowly around the quiet street. "Do you see any here?" The visitor hesitated. Of course he didn't. That was the entire reason he had come. No addresses, no official records, no trace of this place anywhere inside the city's systems. And yet the street was full of life. Families lived here. Children grew up here. People spent entire days moving through routines that looked just like those in any other neighborhood. But according to the rest of the city, none of it existed. The old man watched the confusion slowly settle across the visitor's face. "You're not the first person to come back," he said quietly. The visitor looked up. "What do you mean, come back?" The old man didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his head toward the far end of the street, where the road curved slightly out of view. For a moment, the sounds of the neighborhood faded into the background. Then he spoke again. "Everyone who lives here eventually leaves," he said. "They walk out into the city and become part of the world outside." His voice was calm, matter of fact. "But once they leave," he continued, "the city forgets about this place." The visitor felt the same cold sensation again. "And the people who lived here? The old man turned back toward him. They forget too. Another pause, then the final sentence came quietly. Until one day, for reasons they don't understand, they find their way back. The question that remains. After that conversation, the investigation never truly continued, at least not in the way it had before. The visitor did not return to the city archives the next day looking for more documents. He did not contact local historians or urban planners. He did not publish his findings online or attempted to convince anyone that the street existed. Instead, he simply stopped, not because the mystery had been solved, but because the explanation he had been given was impossible to prove and even harder to ignore. In the days that followed, he tried to approach the situation rationally. Maybe the old man had been mistaken. Perhaps there had once been someone on the street who looked similar to him. Human memory can be unreliable, especially when years have passed. Faces blur together. Stories change. It was possible that the resident had simply confused him with someone else. But that explanation left too many details unanswered. The residents had watched him in a way that suggested familiarity, not curiosity, recognition. And the old man had described a house with a blue door halfway down the street, a detail that had existed before the conversation ever began. When he tried to remember the exact moment he first noticed that door, the memory became strangely unclear. Had he seen it before the man pointed to it? Or had he only begun to notice it after? The more he thought about it, the less certain he became. Eventually, curiosity pushed him to check the maps again. The historical documents still showed the same narrow street between the two larger roads, the same small cluster of houses, the same carefully labeled name that had appeared across decades of city planning records. But modern systems still refused to acknowledge it. Digital maps displayed nothing there. Property registries returned empty results. Population databases contained no trace of the residents who clearly lived on the street. To the rest of the city, the place simply did not exist. Weeks passed, then months. Life returned to its normal rhythm. Work schedules resumed. Daily routines slowly replaced the strange memory of the narrow road hidden between buildings. But sometimes late at night, the visitor would find himself thinking about the street again. Not about the missing records, not about the erased maps, but about the sentence the old man had spoken so calmly. "You left this place years ago." The possibility lingered quietly in the back of his mind, not as a belief, just as a question. Because if the residents were telling the truth, if people really could leave that street and somehow forget it ever existed, then the mystery was much larger than a missing road on a map. It meant the city itself might contain places that exist outside its own memory. Places that continue living quietly between buildings and databases, invisible to everyone who once walked away from them. Which leaves one final question. If the street is still there, and the people living on it remember someone who supposedly left years ago, then who exactly was that person? And more importantly, if he had never lived there before, why did the residents recognize him?
Shadows crawl